So, in just about a year, we're going to get hit with another wave of those JFK files being declassified in 2025. Gets you thinking about all those loose ends, all those lingering questions, right?
Sure does. Just speaks to how much this event still resonates, the mystery, the impact. Still waiting for answers, even after all these years.
Yeah, you asked for it, and we aim to please. You wanted a deep dive into this very first batch of the 2025 release. Just 20 documents fresh out the gate. And we dove right in. Memos, letters, dispatches, a whole mix giving us those early glimpses right into the immediate aftermath of the assassination and the whirlwind of investigations that followed.
It's like getting a sneak peek at a tiny but potentially crucial corner of a much larger puzzle. Even these first 20 can offer some pretty fascinating hints about where investigators were focusing their energy right off the bat.
And as always, our mission here is to cut through the clutter and hand you the key takeaways, the surprising details. Those nuggets that could give you a fresh perspective on this pivotal moment without drowning you in a sea of bureaucratic jargon. Think of it as your fast track to understanding this first peek behind the curtain. And if this appetizer whets your appetite, we're ready to dive deeper as more documents drop.
And it's already jumping out at us, even in this first batch. Certain themes, certain questions popping up again and again, certain subjects that were clearly top of mind right from the get-go.
Yeah, right off the bat, we see the Warren Commission doing what they were tasked to do, digging into Lee Harvey Oswald's life, his movements. You also see hints of probes into potential connections with intelligence agencies in some areas you might not expect, like what it was like for Soviet citizens who married people from other countries. But let's unpack this systematically. Let's start with what these initial docs tell us about the Warren Commission's early investigation.
Makes sense to begin there, given their whole mandate to investigate the assassination. These early docs really shine a spotlight on their initial focus.
So doc number 1, dated June 1st, 1964, document number 104-1003-10041. For those keeping score at home, you can find it online. This one's all about Lee Harvey Oswald's time in Helsinki back in October of '59. The commission seems to have been really keen on nailing down his movements during that trip.
What's really striking is the level of granular detail thereafter, even months after the assassination. They were clearly building a very precise timeline of Oswald's actions during that Helsinki trip.
So they talked to a guy named Frank Freiberg. He'd recently come back from Helsinki, where he'd been with the COS, that's chief of station, by the way. The Warren Commission specifically wanted to hear from him. And Freiberg dropped some pretty specific details, like the average drive time from the airport to downtown Helsinki, about 25 minutes.
Which, on the surface, might seem kind of mundane. But think about it. They're piecing together travel times, trying to match them up with other events, potential meetings Oswald might have had. It becomes relevant, right? Trying to figure out if Oswald's arrival time allowed him to do something specific, meet someone.
Exactly. And Freiberg also mentions that a cab ride from downtown to the Soviet consulate would take, at most, 5 minutes. Now, that's interesting when you consider Oswald's whole fascination with the Soviet Union.
No doubt about it. Oswald being so close to the Soviet consulate, being able to get there so quickly, raises questions. Was he trying to defect? Seeking information? Help? These are the kinds of things the Warren Commission would have been thinking about in those early stages.
And to add another layer, Freiberg throws this in. The Soviet consulate probably closed at 1 p.m. local time on Saturdays back in '59. Again, seems minor, but if they're trying to figure out what Oswald did on a particular Saturday, knowing the consulate's hours could make or break their theories.
Makes sense. If they're looking at a specific window of time for Oswald to make contact, knowing when the consulate closed would be crucial. Every bit of confirmed info, no matter how small, helps paint a fuller picture.
Now, here's something that raises some eyebrows. Freiberg also mentions that those passenger lists, the manifests at the U.S. consulate in Helsinki, were only kept for 6 months. Then, poof, gone. And get this, he mentions a Mr. Robert Fulton, CIA, was a U.S. consular official there at the time.
The fact that they routinely destroyed these records after just 6 months, that's notable. Any official U.S. record of Oswald flying in or out of Helsinki would have been long gone by the time the Warren Commission started digging. And having a CIA officer right there in the consulate, it adds another dimension to the whole story. Was there already intelligence interest in Oswald even before the assassination? Makes you wonder.
Definitely. And to wrap up this first document, Freiberg mentions that any cable inquiry from the State Department would get copied to the Helsinki station. They'd then help put together a response. Freiberg even went the extra mile, cabling the station about things the State Department hadn't asked, even suggesting changes to their cable. Sounds like he was really proactive, trying to gather all the intel he could.
It highlights the communication, the collaboration going on between different parts of the U.S. government trying to piece together Oswald's time in Helsinki. And Freiberg going above and beyond, it kind of suggests he had insights, maybe even concerns, that went beyond what the State Department was initially asking.
Now, the second document, 104-100-004-100143, same date, June 1st, 1964. It's basically a rehash of that Freiberg conversation about Helsinki. Almost identical to the first one, just a slightly different document number.
Two documents covering the same conversation, with just a tiny difference in the document ID. That underscores how important these details about Oswald's travel, his access to the Soviet consulate, were to the Warren Commission. They wanted to make sure these points were documented thoroughly, maybe looked at from slightly different angles.
Yeah, it's like a big neon sign pointing to their early focus on this specific period in Oswald's life. All right, let's switch gears to a different but equally interesting area that pops up in these first 20 documents. Soviet citizens marrying foreigners. Document 104-1004-10213, July 9th, 1964, talks about a discussion with a Warren Commission staffer, a Mr. W. David Slauson.
This one takes us in a different direction. We're moving away from Oswald directly and zooming out to look at the bigger picture Soviet policies, specifically around Soviets who married people from other countries, Americans included.
Right in the memo, it says the whole point of this discussion was to address inconsistencies in the info the Commission was getting from the CIA and the State Department. This all stemmed from a letter from Mr. Richard Helms, dated July 3rd, 1964. So right away, you see potential discrepancies in how different parts of the government were presenting information to the Warren Commission about this specific topic.
And the inconsistencies boil down to some pretty fundamental questions. Were Soviet citizens usually allowed to leave the USSR to join their spouses in their home countries? Could they leave with their foreign spouse, like, at the same time? And how long did it normally take to get a Soviet exit visa if you were in this situation?
So on that first point, leaving the USSR to join your spouse, the memo says the State Department mentioned a quota system for U.S. visas throughout a number of 724 visa applications, mostly from minorities and working relatives. But in the end, they didn't give a straight answer, saying there weren't any specific Soviet laws on the matter.
The fact that the State Department couldn't give a clear answer is telling. Maybe Soviet policy wasn't black and white. Maybe these cases were judged on an individual basis. And bringing up the U.S. quota system further complicates things, showing how both countries' regulations were intertwined.
Then, on whether Soviets could leave simultaneously with their spouses, the memo says, again, the State Department didn't have a definitive answer, even pointed to evidence that simultaneous departures weren't typically allowed.
This is a potentially important point, especially when you think about Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina, who was Soviet. If the Soviets generally frowned upon couples leaving together, that could be relevant to understanding their timeline, any plans they might have had.
They also dug into how long it took to get those Soviet exit visas in these cases. The memo mentions a letter from a Mr. Meeker about this. Then it talks about an analysis of 26 specific cases the Warren Commission was looking at, referencing memos from both Mr. Slauson at the CIA and Mr. Meeker from the State Department.
Looking at these 26 cases would have given the Warren Commission real-world examples of those waiting times for spouses trying to get Soviet visas. Any big discrepancies in how long it took could have been very informative.
And the memo points out that the times did vary, from a few months to much quicker processing for some. And it specifically highlights the apparent inconsistency between what the CIA and State Department were saying about these visa processes.
Having different info from the two agencies raises questions. Were they working with different data, different interpretations, maybe even different perspectives on Soviet policies? It just shows how complicated it was to try and understand the inner workings of the Soviet Union back then.
The document also has these little side notes about Soviets married to foreigners, like Irene Zaslavsky, her husband, Harold Berman, apparently had to really pull strings to get her out of the USSR. It also briefly mentions Leonard Kirsch's Soviet wife arriving in the U.S. and Joseph St. Fondum visiting his American wife in the USSR. These quick glimpses give you a sense of what individuals went through in these situations.
Those personal stories add a human dimension to the policy talk. They show the real obstacles, the struggles people face trying to make these international marriages work, the whole tangle of Soviet emigration policies.
All right, let's look at another document that touches on potential Soviet ties, but from much later. 104-101-12-10-1022, a letter dated May 21st, 1982. This one's about a guy named Valery Vladimirovich Kostakov.
Jumps forward in time quite a bit, but it ties back to our earlier conversation. Kostakov was stationed in Mexico City, a pretty significant place in the whole Oswald story.
Right. The letter lays out Kostakov's work at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City from 59 to 65. Started as a consular officer, later worked as a translator, vice consul, attaché. And here's the kicker. The letter says that while he was in Mexico, he tried to cozy up to U.S. government folks working at the embassy there.
That raises red flags right away. Sounds like classic intelligence work trying to build relationships with U.S. embassy staff to gather intel.
And here's the direct link back to Oswald. In either September or October of 63, Lee Harvey Oswald walks into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, wants a visa to go back to the USSR. Guess who handles his request? Valery Vladimirovich Kostakov.
Confirmed contact between a Soviet intelligence officer and Lee Harvey Oswald just months before the assassination. You have someone linked to intelligence interacting directly with the man who'd later be accused of killing Kennedy. That's a pretty significant detail.
Important to note, though, the letter says there's no info pointing to any other connection between Oswald and Kostakov besides this visa application.
That's crucial. Contact is confirmed, but what kind of contact? Was it just routine consular business or something more? Based on this document alone, it's hard to say.
The letter goes on to mention Kostakov's later work in Mexico, keeping tabs on Central American communist parties. It even says that when he left Mexico in 71, there was speculation that it was because he was known to be Oswald's contact at the embassy.
Speculation, even years later. It just highlights the ongoing questions, the suspicions surrounding potential Soviet involvement, any connection to Oswald. It just wouldn't go away.
Shifting gears again, document 104-1000-10003. A confidential letter from March 30th, 1978. This one references letters from a guy named Sergei Javsorno. Takes us down a rather unusual path.
Yeah, this one introduces someone who claimed to have info about Oswald, info he tried to pass on to U.S. authorities.
The letter, written by a D.H. Jones to a Mr. A.H. Stimson, explains that Zorno said he gave info about Oswald to the American vice consul in Sofia, Bulgaria, back in August of 63. It's just a few months before the assassination. Copies of these letters were apparently sent to the FBI and some head office in London, too. Attached to this letter is another one, straight from Sergei Zorno to the British ambassador, dated March 15, 1978.
Now, Zorno's claims, as laid out in this letter to the British ambassador, they're pretty out there. Got to take them with a grain of salt, considering how much time had passed and the nature of self-reported accounts.
He says he bumped into Oswald in London in July 63, and then again in Vienna. Even more startling, he says he overheard talk about an American defector. He thought it was Oswald who'd gone to Russia and was getting ready to kill President Kennedy.
Those are some serious accusations, especially the part about knowing beforehand about a plot to kill Kennedy. If they thought it was credible, you can see why investigators would be interested.
The correspondence talks about Zorno trying to get this info to different people, British police, the U.S. government. There's another letter from Zorno to the British ambassador, dated February 6, 1978, where he adds more details, expresses his worries. And then there's a letter from a group called the Legal Center for the Disabled, saying they got Zorno's letter about trouble he was apparently having with the police and the FBI, dated March 5, 1978.
This last letter suggests that the authorities Zorno contacted might not have been so quick to believe him, might not have taken him seriously. Paints a picture of someone struggling to be heard.
So, on to document 104-10000766. This is a dispatch from 1968 about an article in The New Yorker by Edward J. Epstein. This one shifts our focus to the aftermath of the Warren Report, the criticisms it faced.
The Epstein article is a major turning point in the whole discussion, the debate about the Warren Commission's conclusions. It really fueled public doubt, helped alternative theories about the assassination gain traction.
The dispatch mentions the huge backlash sparked by Epstein's article. It also brought up the assassination of Robert Kennedy, questioned the official line on JFK's death, hinted at a political murder conspiracy. It even mentions Jim Garrison's investigation down in New Orleans, trying to keep those conspiracy theories alive, alleging that the FBI and CIA stonewalled him.
This really shows the growing distrust, the challenges to the official narrative in the years after the assassinations. The idea that the FBI and CIA weren't cooperating with Garrison would have just added fuel to the fire.
The dispatch explicitly says the article wasn't meant for reprinting. It was for internal use only, especially for those chiefs of station who might be worried about Garrison's investigation and the potential for renewed anti-U.S. sentiment because of these ongoing questions.
It shows a definite concern within the intelligence community about how these criticisms and investigations might affect public opinion here and abroad, how that might damage U.S. interests. They were watching it closely.
Now we have document 104, 1000, 10078, a routing and record sheet, November 26, 1968. It mentions correspondence related to the Warren Commission, specifically correspondence between CIA and ASIO read release of information by Warren Commission. ASIO, for those not in the know, is the Australian Security Intelligence Organization.
So this doc points to communication, potentially cooperation between intelligence agencies across borders, talking about the Warren Commission's findings, maybe even declassifying or releasing certain info, suggests the assassination and its investigation had ripples beyond U.S. shores.
Building on that, document 104, 10000, 1000079, a memo from around the same time. It's about a letter from Sir Charles Spry, the head honcho at ASIO.
This one gives us more specifics about the CIA's info exchange with their Australian counterparts. They were definitely talking.
Sir Charles Spry recommended they declassify a specific Warren Commission document, CD 971. The memo says this document was all about ASIO's investigation into anonymous calls to the Australian embassy in Canberra before and after Kennedy's assassination.
A very specific recommendation. Those anonymous calls must have been pretty significant to Australian intelligence to trigger an investigation, and they thought their findings might be relevant to understanding the bigger picture of what happened.
The memo says they agreed to consider Sir Charles's points when deciding about future declassifications of Warren Commission stuff. They were open to hearing what their international partners had found, at least.
Reinforces the fact that the Kennedy investigation wasn't just a U.S. thing. There was a whole network of intelligence agencies involved, a global effort to gather information.
Now we jump ahead again. Documents 104, 100012, 10051 from 91, and 104, 10064 from 93. Both messages, subject line, Cuba tidbits from late November SRAC. The 91 document have none listed for the requested action, which is interesting.
These later documents, they're not directly about the immediate aftermath in '63, but they tell us that Cuba and related matters remained on the intelligence radar for years.
The 93 document has some juicy bits. It includes SRAC transcripts, basically, transcripts of intercepted communications from late 93. Apparently, these conversations show some folks in Havana weren't too happy about the prospect of Cuban elections, the possibility of the current leadership losing. One official even thought Fidel Castro would lose and they'd have to redo the elections.
Gives you a peek into Cuban politics much later, but the fact that it's included in these JFK files makes you wonder about potential links, ongoing intelligence interests.
The 93 document also mentions a meeting in mid-May 93. Some Cuban officials were traveling to Cuba, an unofficial visit, they called it, and they talked with Fidel Castro himself. And it notes a conversation from November 93, a Cuban official talking to a Kennedy assassination investigator and giving them some info.
So even 30 years after the assassination, people claiming to have relevant info were still talking to investigators. Shows you the long-lasting impact, the ongoing quest for answers.
It's a reminder that this story, the search for truth, didn't end with the Warren report. It went on for decades.
Absolutely. And these Cuba tidbits being in these JFK files suggests Cuba remained a point of interest, even if the connection in these 90s docs isn't as direct.
Next, document 104, 1004, 100065. A secret cable from November 93 about a KGB official named Nikonov. Again, much later than 63.
So this one's a profile of a KGB officer who was involved with the CIA decades after JFK's assassination. It's probably here because they were still trying to understand any Soviet role, any knowledge they might have had about the assassination.
The cable lays it all out. Nikonov's background as a professor in Moscow, his KGB work starting in '76, different positions he held, assessments of how good he was at intelligence, how reliable he was. It mentions his family's ties to the Soviet elite, his job preparing answers for the KGB-CIA liaison relationship.
So a well-connected, seasoned KGB officer involved in some pretty sensitive stuff with the CIA. Having this detailed profile in the JFK files suggests that understanding these later interactions was considered important even decades later.
Now we have a couple undated documents. 104, 1000 on 1001, a field distribution beat #5847 list, and 104, 1009, 1022, another distribution list, but no date, no addressee.
These offer a glimpse into how the intelligence agency worked, how they spread information, even if they don't deal directly with the JFK assassination.
The first list, BD #5847, lists different regions: AF for Africa, FE for Far East, UR for Europe, WH for Western Hemisphere, and then specific cities in each region. Shows you how global their intelligence operations were back then.
Gives you an idea of the scale, the sheer reach of the agency. This vast network for gathering information all over the world. It was a huge undertaking.
The second distribution list uses different codes. Lists internal recipients. It's like a peek into the agency's structure, how information flowed between departments and divisions.
These internal documents might seem boring at first glance, but for researchers trying to figure out how the agency worked, how they managed and controlled information, they're gold.
Okay, 104, 1006, 10247, a name check and consolidation request form dated November 10th, 1960. This one's for a couple, Roman Fedorovich Dedkov and his wife, Volasa Nikolaevna Dedkov.
This one's from before the assassination, but it shows how they routinely tracked people who might be of interest. Intelligence work never stops.
The form says they were applying for visas to India. Dedkov's job is listed as potentially working at the Soviet embassy in New Delhi, teaching English. Their birth dates, places of birth in the USSR, Dedkov's Soviet passport number, it's all there. He was supposed to arrive in New Delhi in September 60 for a 2-year gig, but they note that it's unknown if he actually showed up.
A name check like this was to see if there were any existing files, any intel on these people. Even something as seemingly ordinary as a visa application could trigger a check if they had any suspicious connections or raised any red flags.
Second to last document, 104, 107, 10345, a dispatch from December 24th, 1964. It's about Warren Commission testimony selected excerpts.
Clearly, they were trying to keep key people in the loop about the Warren Commission's progress, the key findings. Sharing is caring, right?
Sent to all chiefs of station, so wide distribution. It says they're sending selected parts of testimony given to the Warren Commission, specifically to keep those senior officers informed. Interestingly, it says pertinent portions have been sidelined for easier reading. Someone was highlighting the important stuff internally.
Shows they were paying close attention to the Warren Commission's work, making sure their top brass was up to speed on the key details, the testimonies.
Last but not least, document 104 1005 10321, classified message, September 30th, 1964. This one's about a guy named Joachim Jostin.
Joachim Jostin, a journalist, a writer, known for being anti-Khrushchev, anti-Soviet. Kind of intriguing that he pops up in the JFK files.
The message mentions his writings against Khrushchev, his past work against Nazi Germany. It asks for a full background check on Jostin, his life before World War II, any Gestapo records showing he joined the German Communist Party, where he'd been since May 32, why he wasn't at his library in Berlin, his last known address. This request is classified, dated 64, so the Warren Commission definitely had a reason to want this info, and they wanted it fast.
Joe Riston being on the Warren Commission's radar probably means they were looking into anyone and everyone who might have had a motive, any connection to the assassination, especially those who were openly anti-Soviet during the Cold War. You got to explore all angles.
So that's it for our deep dive into the first 20 documents from the 2025 JFK declassification. Quite the mix, right? We've got the Warren Commission laser-focused on Oswald's travels, those Soviet connections, the whole complicated situation with Soviets marrying foreigners. Then, later documents hinting at continued interest in Cuba, guys like Kostikov and Zorno.
Just a small sample, a taste of what's to come, but even these 20 give us a fascinating look at those early investigations, the broader intelligence world surrounding the JFK assassination. They raise a lot of questions, point to areas that clearly intrigued investigators and intelligence agencies. And hey, if you're hooked, we're ready to dig into the next batch when it drops. Just let us know.
Absolutely. Even this little batch gives us plenty to chew on. We hope this deep dive gave you a good understanding of those early investigations without overwhelming you with too much info.
What's really fascinating is how even these initial peeks into the files start to shape our understanding of what investigators prioritize, how wide-ranging their inquiries were after the assassination. It's really mind-blowing.
It really is.
Yeah.
So here's something to think about. Based on what we've seen in these first 20 documents, what strikes you about the investigations that followed JFK's assassination? What new questions pop up for you? What old questions are still lingering?
Makes you think about all the info that's still out there, what insights those future documents might hold. It's a story that just keeps unfolding.
Exactly. Let us know what you think about these first 20 documents. And if you want us to keep diving deeper as more of the JFK files are released, just tell us. We're here to explore this historical